The Gospel according to Luke, the 20th chapter. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first married a woman and died childless. And then the second and the third married her. And so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. And Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry or are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and they are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses showed himself in the story about the bush, where he speaks to the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living. For to him all them are alive. The gospel of the Lord. In the spring of 1970, I graduated from college and was going to the seminary. But I needed to complete a portion of my degree, and that was part of one of my majors was hospital administration. And the other was sociology. And so I needed to take an internship or a residency. And so I spent 3 or 4 months in the summer at Metropolitan Medical Center, which at the time was Swedish and St. Barnabas hospitals in Minneapolis, and which is ironic and one of those things, you know, how things kind of come around and so forth. And Swedish Hospital is where I was born. And they were in the process of merging into Metropolitan Medical Center, which is now in downtown Minneapolis. And one of the things that I was, as an administrator, I was able to do was to go into surgery and view open heart surgery. Now, in 1970, you realize that open heart surgery was sort of in its infancy at that point, and so it wasn't something that was just very, what should I say, not routine. But I was there and went into surgery with 2 people. Actually, it was 2 women. They were to have open heart surgery, and I was able to be here, and the head of the patient was right here. I was to one side, and the anesthesiologist was on the other side, and I was able to view this whole procedure amongst these 2 women. And I stayed for some time, but not for the whole surgery. And then it came to me later that the younger woman died, and the older woman survived the surgery. It's sort of been a long, long trek in the beginning, because even in college, one of my tasks was combining hospital administration and medical care with sociology. And in that time, if you think back, those of you, most of you are of that age, those kinds of things, medical care was changing a lot. And so as a result of that, things were different. Things were much different than they are now. And so death and dying was something in which most people avoided the death part, and they had only thing to do with the dying. And over the years, I've served many years in hospice, helping to start a bereavement program, helping to start a hospice, in a couple of hospice programs, which deals with the grief and loss of one who's dying. And one of the things that we can say about that is how it's changed. Because I remember living in Arizona and working in hospice, and we had a wonderful medical director, but he was under constant pressure by physicians who would go to any lengths to save this person's life. And then they would do what I began to call dumping. And that is when all hope was lost, when absolutely there was nothing they could do, and it was just a matter of maybe hours to days in which they were to die, they would enroll them in hospice, as if that was to be helpful. What it really was that whole avoidance of death and not coming to terms with that. And I guess as I look out amongst us here, most of us probably have had many of those thoughts in those recent years. What about our own death? What about living? And what about life? What about the life we have to live yet? Well, in the gospel this morning, it is about living and dying. And we have this group of people called the Sadducees that come to Jesus, and they think they're going to kind of pull a fast one on him or have a good argument and trying to figure out what in the world he would respond and what he would say about this. Because they have in their law something called a Levirate marriage, Levite, Levirate marriage. It goes way back to Moses and so forth. And the whole deal was that if your husband died and you were childless, your husband brother was to marry you and have children through you. So I think about Carol. What happens if you'd have to marry Ardith if your brother died too early and not had any children? So it's a little bit different than what we're used to, I guess. And of course, it's a day in which there were multiple wives as well. We know that from Rebecca and Rachel, as well as others. And so the obligation and duty was to marry and to have children because the immortality of the people, or the person, was to be carried on through their genealogical line, particularly through the male. And so if they were childless, they were lost. They were gone. They were not living anymore. And so this wasn't a feeble attempt, at best, of trying to figure out how in the world can this person in this life continue on after death. And you see, it's sort of what we might call a way in which God speaks about the living and not the dead. How it is that people struggle with that, and even back then, how they struggled with the idea of how do we keep on living and we don't want to have either death, die, or how do we keep on living? And so the Sadducees, who are, generally speaking, a wealthier bunch, they're often priests, they like the status quo, they like it just the same. They're very controlling. They want to have it just so it's, we can honestly say, so they can have the way in which they want to have it. And so now they come to Jesus with this conundrum, you might say. And what does Jesus say? Well, this may be bad news for those of you out there, but, he says, no. After the resurrection, there's no marrying because that's a part of this life. This is a part of this world. You see, marrying is one way in which we keep order within our own life and how life perpetuates itself. And marriage is something here that's part of our life. The key thing here, I think, is to understand that the way we understand living again, or heaven, or however you want to look at it, is a fact in which is based upon what we understand and perceive. What Jesus is telling the Sadducees is, this is the way you look at life, and this is the way you understand it here. But you got to forget about all that. The resurrected life is a whole different life. The resurrected life is not something that's here and now. It's something to come, even though we are to live like that as a resurrected person because of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus is saying our life is to be resurrected in a new way. We have to have a new and different perspective upon life. We are still caught and trapped, if you will, in the life in which we live because we need to make sense of this. We need to have order. We need to be able to persevere and to live out the life that we've been given. But when we think about the resurrected life, we really don't have any idea of what it's going to be. Because our only source of reference is what we know now, what we know in this life. And Jesus is questioning them or even putting them on the spot, saying that you do not realize how different the resurrected life is going to be. You only have the reference of what you know in your own life right now. And that's the deal with Jesus. That's the point that he is making. And for us to understand that, if you think through your lifetime, for all of us who are older especially, and we think back 40, 50, 60, 70 years or more, think about how different life is now than it was in the 50s or 60s. Or 40s, or 30s. How do you explain that to someone who is 20? How do you explain that to someone who's 14? If you wanted to watch a TV program in the 1960s, you had to watch the TV program. Now you can even see, and they even put it on the TV, like, well, start your video recorder. You can watch it again. You can get it online. You can find it all over the place. You see, that's the kind of difference of trying to understand how different the resurrected life is. And we could go on and list all kinds of things. And I think if we went back, and I think my dad at this point, he was born in 1904, and he says, I grew up in the horse and buggy era, and yet I saw him go to the moon. How different. How astounding. Think about Thomas Jefferson, an architect, a statesman, all kinds of skills. What would he think about computers? And about the internet, about bridges that span great chasms, about all those things. To understand that and to see that and to have that perspective. And unless you've experienced that, unless you see that, you just don't grasp it. And that's Jesus' message to us and to the Sadducees, is that we have to, in a sense, throw out our own frame of reference and come to a new frame of reference that comes through the resurrection and through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For them to understand that, they have to come to the faith that Jesus is the one who exemplifies the resurrected life, that he leads a life totally different and even contrary to the life of the people who surround him in his everyday life. Trying to get them to understand that the resurrected life is something quite different and quite wonderful. I didn't know that we were going to use My Redeemer Lives until I got to church this morning and saw it was one of the Patty had chosen the hymn. And so my thought was that was the way I'm ending. And so we began that way, we should end that way. We're not going to sing it. We're not going to go through all the 8 verses. But if you look at that, if you have access, or you want to take a hymnal home, if I dare say that, bring it back. But look at those 8 verses. Look at those 8 verses about what the resurrected life means. How significant that is. How that changes your outlook and your perspective, your attitude. How it's so contrary and even so vastly different from the world in which we surround ourselves every day. You see, those words that Job spoke in the 19th chapter, verse 25, have become famous words. And it's ironic that he would say, if they'd only write these down on stone and iron and so forth and chisel them out. And they are. If there's one line in the book of Job that is remembered, it's, I know that my Redeemer lives, or my Vindicator. I like Redeemer better. I know that my Redeemer lives. And the context in which Job brings that to fore is a tragic situation of losing everything, his family, his possessions, his earthly life. But in the end, the only thing that counts, even though his sons and daughters are killed, even though his wealth is gone, through all of that difficulty, he says something that is in a sense quite contrary to the human experience and the human response. When he says that I know that my Redeemer lives, there will be nothing that can change my view. No matter what happens to me in my life, I know that my Redeemer lives, and because he lives, I will live too. And that's the message that Jesus has for the Sadducees and for us. Jesus says, I and the Father are for the living, not the dead. And so may the peace of God that surpasses all understanding keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.